$31 billion globally, and that's just the Marvel movies. Superheroes are big business, and they have a massive cultural footprint. But with their ubiquity, what does that mean? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is the Doha Debates podcast.
When they asked me to write Black Panther, I didn't say yes immediately.
I think superhero films solve a problem for the elite.
We live in a society that enables the Joker to come out, and nobody's stopping to say, this is actually really wrong.
Here's my card.
Yeah, it's just causing a whole hurricane in my mind.
Our debate today, have superheroes become the moral leaders of our time? Joining me today is New York Times bestselling author Nnedi Okorafor, who's written issues of Marvel's Black Panther, as well as the acclaimed Binti trilogy. Welcome. I'd also like to welcome Hussein Rashid, a scholar of religion and pop culture who's produced award-winning work on what it means to be Muslim in America. He's also a comic book collector. Really good to have you here. And social critic and journalist Keith Spencer, who's written on topics from Silicon Valley to superhero movies taking over the world. Thank you all for coming. Nnedi, I'll start with you because you have firsthand experience as a comic book writer among your many accolades. What is a superhero and what makes them super?
That's how we're going to start with definitions. And this, I don't know. Definitions to me, they feel very limiting. So, I mean, what is a superhero? For me, we know that superheroes started with I think Superman. Superman might have been the first. And so we know that. We know that the word came from a specific type of character. But for me, so is the question, what do I think the definition of superheroes are to me, or the general definition? Those are two different things, very different things.
Well, I will lay the groundwork for this conversation. Every question is a question for you and your opinion. So yeah, to you, Nnedi, what is a superhero? How do you define it?
To me, the idea of a superhero is very broad. It is not based in DC and Marvel.
Right.
It's very broad. It's very grounded. So I guess to me, superhero is a character. I'll say a character because it could be a non-human, so I won't say human being. But it is a character that has some type of ability. And a character that has some type of ability, that's some type of powerful ability, who also has a sort of spiritual or moral obligation to use that ability for the greater good, above their own pleasure. And who goes out, and a superhero can be flawed and have all kinds of just specifics, but that's what a superhero is to me, who has that need to use that ability that they have for the greater good.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. Keith, as author of an article entitled "Superhero Films Are Bad for Democracy," what is a superhero to you?
Yeah, I think that a superhero is someone who has capacity to do great violence. I mean, I think superheroes are distinguished by the fact that they have a unique capacity to exercise violence. They may not always be violent, but like the fact that they have that capability, right? That's sort of what makes them super. And typically in superhero movies and superhero, narratives, they're essentially fulfilling a similar role to the military or to police. So they use this sort of capacity to do violence to have a kind of policing role in the world or in the narrative.
Wow. Okay, Hussein, I'm going to kick this off to you because I heard moral obligation from one corner,
Yep.
and I heard the capacity for great violence in the other corner. So for you, when you hear superhero, do they offer moral guidance? Is that what a superhero is?
So I'm so grateful for the question and the responses from both my panelists, because I actually have spent a lot of time thinking about what a superhero is and does. And I think it's really important to distinguish a superhero in a Western Anglophone context versus elsewhere in the world. So 100%, I agree with Nnedi that, it's when we look at somebody like Superman, who Nnedi mentioned, this is somebody we tend to think of superheroes as people who have extra human ability, who then have a pro-social mission, like they want to do good in the world as a result of getting this ability. And they often have secret identities, which is, I think, another important part of the secret superhero definition. But when you go to other parts of the world, it's often quite the opposite. It's because people have a pro-social mission that they want to do good, that they get these special powers. And I think one of the better known examples of a hero that would fit this mold in English is the Black Panther, T'Challa, who wants to do good for his community and is thus blessed by this supernatural being, Bast, who then imbues him with the powers of the Black Panther. And I think that sort of worldview we have to take very seriously as well. And I think that speaks then to Keith's point, is the idea of the Western superhero having these deep fascistic elements is sort of in there. If you're like, I only want to be, well, you talk about violence, I'm going to think broader about the idea of wanting to push for law and order above all else, because they are surrogates for law enforcement. They are surrogates for the military in many ways. I think it's really important to when you say I'm being pro-social because I have these powers, that's what lends itself, is that, oh, but what if I didn't want to do good with these powers?
Right.
As opposed to saying I get these powers because I am doing good and it's dependent on me doing good. And so I think you see both of these things in play at the same time in a lot of the heroes we know in the Anglophone world.
Nnedi, he mentioned Black Panther, and of course, I have to go to you as someone who has written for the Marvel comic Black Panther. What's your take on what he just said?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things that I'm thinking about, but
Don't hold back. Anytime you're thinking something, we want to hear it.
okay, so I'll come back to Black Panther, but I'm thinking about this idea of the superheroes and violence as well, like that being within the definition. I think that I just think it's broader. I think that there are superheroes who have no violent tendencies at all. I think there should be space for that type of character too. This idea that someone can be a superhero and not have the capacity to do violence, not have super strength, not have these abilities that can do harm. Like you can be a superhero without the ability to do harm. And I've interrogated that idea for a while. Like what type of character is that? So there's that. Back to Black Panther. He's a character that as he's the reason why I wrote him was because I really liked the way that T'Challa, we're talking about T'Challa because there are multiple Black Panthers. The way that T'Challa interrogated the idea of the superhero. That's one of the things that because I won't write just any superhero. I'm not into this idea of, oh, this character is really known. I just want to do that. I don't care about that. But T'Challa, he's a flawed character who is battling with the individual versus the community. And he has strong things that he wants as a person, and then this idea of the community, who he is, the idea of noblesse oblige, and the decisions that he makes, and then how those decisions shift him, and those decisions that give him those abilities, and then he has to figure out what to do with those abilities. That's a very interesting type of superhero to me, where your choices kind of result in the abilities that you have, and you are capable of doing great harm, but you have this moral. You have an internal moral compass that guides everything that you do, but that leads to conflicts as well. So writing him was really interesting, as for writing a superhero, and that was one of the reasons why I wanted to write him.
I keep hearing the word moral compass, morality from this side of the table. And so I'm wondering what you think of that, especially given the issue we're here to debate on whether or not they offer moral guidance. Where do you fall?
Yeah, I mean, well, so I should note, most of what I've written about superheroes, it relates to the films, right? Comics tend to have really different, morals and political economy than I think you see in superhero movies. I mean, these are huge, big budget productions. The U.S. military is involved in a lot of them. And, Nnedi, I've read your comics. And I think that they're, you write really beautifully about the political economy is very different in the Wakandan world that you write about. Wakanda is the home of the Black Panther, and have like very interesting anti-colonial or sort of counter-colonial messaging too. You don't see this as much in movies, in the superhero movies. So a lot of the analysis of in thinking about superhero films that I've done, I think like morally in general, I should say this doesn't apply to all superhero movies, but just in general, one of the main messages that is repeated in a lot of these narratives is like superheroes operate extrajudicially, right? They have power from their ability to sort of either do great violence, or in some cases, they have sort of ESP, or they can manipulate people sometimes when in certain ways that can fulfill their duties as like being an authority or like sort of like policing. And I also think morally, like the other thing that troubles me, I guess, about superhero films morally is the black and white view of the world that they often, not always, but often have in them. And I've been thinking about this a lot recently, just like superhero movies have really taken off in the last 20 years, right? There's been more and more produced pretty much every year. I mean, the last 5 years has been a little bit of a falling off, but and this is also the same moment in the United States in politics when like we're a more polarized country than maybe in like a century or so. I mean it's interesting to me that political polarization and this sort of black and white thinking that you see overall reflected in like the American polity is sort of mirrored in superhero movies. And I've wondered often like if these two things are related, if these two things are connected, right? The other thing morally that I've been really troubled by lately is like so currently as we're recording, there's this man named Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who was just because of administrative error, he was deported and sent to this like El Salvadorian prison, and a lot of like Trump himself and a lot of his sort of right wing acolytes, that they actually like this. They're happy with this. They're happy with this sort of extrajudicial, like no due process situation with this man, right? He's, that's fine. And I was thinking, where would Americans get this idea that like, oh, we don't need due process, like, and actually this is a really common theme in a lot of superhero films, right? Where like in a lot of the Marvel and DC movies, you have these moments where the superheroes are sort of fighting back against the state's desire to involve the judicial process, right? In some aspect of arresting and charging the supervillains typically, right? And that's like, it's problematic to them. They just want to go and do violence or not, they don't think that, I think that. They just want to go and enforce, what they see of as the right or wrong, moral laws. They want to enforce their own morality. And the courts and the justice system is sort of messy. They can just do it themselves. And I've wondered often, this is kind of mirrored in what we're seeing right now. And weirdly, I mean, this is, liberals maybe don't like to admit this, but I also think back during the Obama administration, right? Like when Osama bin Laden was when there was the mission to sort of assassinate him, right? There was no judicial process involved in that whatsoever, right? I mean, and it's like the Navy SEALs flew down and just shot him in the head, and they didn't even like he was like sleeping in his bed. I mean, it wasn't in the interest of the United States to have any judicial process involved. And I was like, wow, this is very similar to like a trope that you see in a lot of superhero movies.
I think one of the things I really appreciate that point, Keith. I do wonder though, part of the reason I like to study pop culture professionally is because I think it is both aspirational, that is guiding us to where we're going to be, but it's also reflective of the society. It's, it's the trailing edge of where the society is. So,
Yeah.
is the authoritarianism that you're reading into movies, which I agree is there in quite a few of them, is that leading us, is that making it more acceptable for our politics, or is it simply mirroring our politics, thinking about when the bin Laden murder happened,
Yeah.
the bin Laden assassination happened, and then choosing to dump him at sea, that extrajudicial process, and then when the movie started reflecting that sort of space. And again, I think I also want to point out, and I think just staying in the filmic world, because I do think comics are separate, but in the small screen version, authority is not to be trusted, law enforcement is not to be entrusted because they're also abuse of power. So how do people build and protect themselves? I think is also something that is part of that discourse too.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, with regards to like, I mean, that's a good question, right? It's like the chicken and egg question, which came first.
No.
I mean, and I think it could be hard to say for sure. I mean, one thing I will say is like the films, particularly, right? Superhero movies, and this applies to I think probably the majority of Marvel movies that they typically work very closely with the American military because the American military will give, and this is true about Hollywood in general, not just superhero movies, but like the U.S. military will lend you their equipment and let you use and show shots with jets or planes or whatever, but they need to review the script, right? They need to have some control over the script and make sure that it portrays the military well. And they've admitted that a lot of superhero movies are like good recruitment tools, right? Particularly like there's like a Captain Marvel, right? Who is a character who is a fighter pilot, right, before becoming a superhero. And so there's definitely, I mean, regardless of other political questions, this relationship, there's definitely in a lot of superhero movies, like they are very overtly propaganda for the U.S. military, and they're intimately involved in the process. So it's interesting too, like to me, that they're also exported abroad. I mean, it'd be one thing for like, you have a nation state and like the United States, and it obviously it wants to recruit for the military, right? But then these movies are exported abroad and sometimes make more money abroad than here, right? So it's kind of this very interesting way for like U.S. empire to export its values and to show the world, oh, the U.S. military is good, or it's like maybe some questionable things happen on the road, but at the end of the movie, it's going to come out looking good, and American power is good and important.
Well, it sounds like soft power, Nnedi. It looks like you want to get in, but I'm wondering if that's true, does that mean that we are outsourcing our ideas of morality to these big for-profit corporations?
I'm just thinking about our movies being used as propaganda. That's all I'm thinking about. I'm like, these things could never be done in comics. There's a reason why the comics are often so different from what you see in the movies. No one's swooping in to dictate, what we're writing and what we can and can't do, and the ideas that we can and can't interrogate. And the comics tend to be a lot more complex, and I think a lot of it has to do with that hands in the pot, like far fewer hands in the pot, but also those of us writing the comics, the way that we write them, it's like we're conscious of all of those things, and a lot of times we're writing back to those things. So I think there's a lot more money involved in the movies. We're dealing with a much wider audience, and that may be why you have the military coming in and being like, oh, we can use this to kind of get people used to these ideas, so there's that. With comics, though, it's much smaller audience, but it's interesting that it's the same characters. It's interesting that those who love those characters they'll consume the movies, but they'll go and also read the comics, and I think that's encouraging. But
Do you have an example of when you've been able to take the license to fight back against those narratives? Because I'm thinking of Black Panther in particular. And in the movie, there's a CIA character. Historically, the CIA is not seen as a favorable entity, but in this movie, he's a good guy. But the movie gets some digs in at him. So how are you able to push back?
I mean, for me, one of the things that I had a lot of problems with the concept of Wakanda, and I had a lot of problems with it. I almost like when they asked me to write Black Panther, I didn't say yes immediately
Mm.
because I don't like monarchies, you know, and then the concept of Wakanda in Africa. So there's all of that. Just didn't make sense to me. Like you've got this super technologically advanced, extremely wealthy African society. It's small and they choose to hide. They've chosen to hide for a very long time while all the things were going on in Africa, during colonialism, all of that going on. And that's very problematic. And then when they come out, they're more their interaction is more with the United States than the countries around. So I had a lot of issues with the ideas that were being pushed through the concept of Wakanda. So when I sat down that was one of the reasons eventually when I decided to write Black Panther, that was one of the reasons I felt like I'm like, okay, well maybe I can try to fix some of these from the inside. And so when in Long Live the King, I had these societies called the mute zones that were outside of Wakanda. I showed more of the Wakandan people. So you may have a monarchy, but you see T'Challa on the ground. He has to walk into a community on foot. So all of those things were very intentional. I don't know if they're doing that in the movies. I don't know if you've got the writers having that power. There are just a lot more hands in the pot in the movies.
Hussein, I want to bring you in here. We heard Nnedi say, talk about ideas that are being pushed, and that brings us back to the idea of propaganda and whether or not these movies are being used as propaganda. Is that true, or are there some intrinsic moral values that we can take from superheroes?
I think it is really important to recognize the business side of this. Exactly as Keith said, the military gets their hands on this. We see the same thing on the small screen. Anytime you involve law enforcement, the cops have to be involved. An organization called Color of Change did this great write-up on how we've normalized the erosion of our rights because of the crime procedurals we watch. Because it's just a little, oh yeah, maybe they can go in without a warrant, and it becomes more normal. So I think it's really important to recognize that that is really true and underpinning. And it is, as Nnedi said, an external factor coming in. And when we look at the superheroes, to your question is, what is the moral or what is the exemplary aspect that they're offering? I think it's really important. One of the earliest comic books after Superman that sort of has this wide recognition is Captain America. Captain America starts as Steve Rogers. He's this weakling. He really wants to sign up for the army and fight the Nazis in World War II. He keeps getting rejected. He's accepted to the experimental program. He gets this super soldier formula and becomes Captain America. And the first cover of Captain America is Captain America punching Adolf Hitler. That's propaganda too. It never shows up inside the comic, but it is the cover. Because the people who are writing comics at this time are people, and this comes back to my question of, is it the leading edge or the trailing edge? The people who are writing comics at this time are predominantly Jewish, and they're invested in what's happening in the European theater and are trying to mobilize people. And so Captain America represents this morality. It's a projection of American morality abroad, of the need to get involved in this war. And I can go into some additional symbolism if we've got time of his costume and all of that. But I think that when we look,
don't tease us and then not go into it.
Okay, fine.
What's propaganda about his costume?
It's not so much propaganda, but it is. We are looking. The reason that so many Jewish creators are in the comic book industry at this time is because of anti-Semitism in America, right? These are ghettoized industries. Comic books weren't considered good spaces, so the Jews could have them, and that's where Jewish populations were pushed into. So a lot of the narrative, but there's a story that comes out of Prague of a figure called the Golem, and this is a story from medieval Europe where to protect the Jewish communities from pogroms, created this being that would come alive at night and protect the community. And on his forehead was written the word Emet, meaning truth. And the golem was supposed to sleep at night, and he didn't. And eventually, the golem starts rampaging because it hasn't slept,
Mm.
and they have to put the golem to sleep basically by erasing the first letter of Emet. So it says Met, meaning death in Hebrew.
Oh, that's great.
But the first, but this it gets better. It gets better. The first letter, Emet, it's written as an E in English, but it's actually Aleph, the first letter
Yeah.
in
Oh,
in
wow.
Hebrew. And of course, what is the thing that Captain America has on his cowl is
Oh.
the A, which stands for America, but also truth, right? If you add the A to Emet or Met, it becomes truth.
Wow.
Oh,
He's standing
man.
for truth. And there, there's all sorts of symbolism. Now, whether this is true or not, it's a back reading, it doesn't matter, but this is part of the mythos around the character.
Mm.
And so understanding that there is an embedded morality, there's an embedded cultural memory here that we're reading into it, and there's a projection of a national moral engagement that I think is really important. And I don't think it's coincidental that in 2016, artists recreated that cover, but instead of Captain America punching Adolf Hitler, it was Miss Marvel, the first Muslim superhero in the Marvel universe to headline her own series, punching Donald Trump. And the exact same setup. And I don't think that's coincidental,
Mm.
right? Because she was introduced a couple of years before. It was a major cultural moment. And as Trump is obviously proposing the Muslim ban, it's the same sort of analogy that people are seeing and investing in, embedding in. So I think that there are in the comics, you have the ability to tell morally complex stories and people to take moral stands because these are stories that run over years, right? Whereas the movies have to be done. I think the latest Hulk movie was just over 2 hours, right? So, but it feels long for a movie, but it's actually not long in terms of storytelling. And so I think the narrative has to be cleaner and sharper. And at the same time, you get the second Captain America movie was Civil War, which is about what do you do to limit people who are different than you, right? And there's a great metaphorical conversation in that. Now, you can read it very simply like the law is right no matter what, or what is our moral obligation to people who are different than us and how do we manage that difference? Even if they are more powerful than us, it's still a question of how do we manage our fear. So I think there are moral questions in these, and these characters then play out these moral tales.
Mm. Do you see those moral threads underneath superheroes?
Yeah, I mean, I think superheroes they're very complicated. Like more, I mean, I have a sort of my specific take that I've written about a bit, but I won't deny that they're very morally complex. I mean, I'm very fascinated by I didn't know this originally about Captain America and the Aleph and stuff. I mean, the funniest irony is that like in the film casting of the first few Captain America movies, like what was that actor's name? Chris, was it one of the Chris's?
Well, it's one of the
It's one of the
Chris's.
Chris's.
I can't
It's one of the
remember them. I was
Chris's.
confused them. Well, anyway, but he's like the most Aryan looking dude. I mean, it's
Chris
really
Evans,
funny
yeah.
that Chris Evans. It's really funny that it was originally supposed to be sort of like written as like a sort of Jewish cultural figure trope. Given that,
There is a story behind that as well.
yeah, of
course.
funny. Yeah, I mean, more this to go back to this question that you asked about, like are the morals in superhero movies are the tropes, is the propaganda? I mean, is this bleeding edge or is this following? We haven't really talked about this yet, but something in superhero movies that's definitely bleeding edge and deliberate, and executives have said, is the way that they talk about technology, right? So I mean, I think most this is a normalized idea, right? The idea that technology is inherently good. Technological development is inherently good, right? More technology makes us better. The way to save the world is through technology. We'll get to be a more progressive and democratic world through more technology, right? But if you look at the world, I mean, we're at the most sort of technologically advanced point we've ever been. And actually, there's a huge amount of democratic backsliding in the world. And American inequality is much greater than it was 50, 60 years ago when there was less technology. So this idea that technology is what makes the world like better, what makes civilization better, I don't think is something that is necessarily true. Silicon Valley wants you to believe this. And you see this so much in superhero movies, like, like Iron Man, for instance, is it's a character with no powers. He's powerful because of his ability to use and wield
Wealth. Yeah.
technology.
Mm.
And in Black Panther, it's like the specific access to vibranium, this sort of like a magical kind of element that has a lot of different properties, and their ability to use this resource and this technology is what makes them sort of powerful. And this is the thing that was very explicitly said by some studio execs at Marvel, was like, so we're on the third, or at least in the last 20 years, the third iteration of Spider-Man, right? And Spider-Man was originally, at least in the Sam Raimi movies and the next set of movies, he was like a working class hero. He was sort of, his motto is like your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. He was like a working class figure and poor and often kind of scrounging to live, right? Not so with the newest Spider-Man, right? I mean, like he's totally sort of teched out, and he's friends with Iron Man, who sort of gives him unique access to technology, and that's partly what makes his powers are no longer just coming from his webs that he shoots out of his arms. It's like he has sort of glasses and suit and technology. And there was like a Marvel exec who was interviewed about this, who was like, yeah, I mean, this is the way the culture's going. People think that technology is like, cool and good and makes, the world better or whatever. So that was like very deliberately sort of a change in the character. And he's no longer is really like this impoverished, kid trying to scrounge to live. Like he has money is not really his concern anymore, the way it was in previous Spider-Mans.
That sounds so subtle. And yet, Nnedi, I wonder what you think the lesson that might be teaching us, because superheroes are frequently the elites. We're thinking royalty, Thor, T'Challa. They are billionaires like Iron Man, or like Batman, or like Professor Xavier. What should we take from that? The everyday common man, your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, it cannot be the working class anymore. Is that what we're hearing?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the issues that I've always had with, in particular, superhero movies, the role of wealth.
Yeah.
I've always had that issue where I'm always feeling like I'm just mentally pushing back. I'm like, I don't buy this. And that idea of I guess I'm saying these things now, fine. Okay. But that idea of these films pushing propaganda doesn't feel it feels problematic to me. Because we're talking about technology. With the technology always comes wealth, because you can't have the technology without money that you spend to create those things. So that idea goes hand in hand. And so, like, that's always been an issue for me. And so with Wakanda, with Batman, which, even though I love the Christopher Nolan Batman, was it Batman Begins?
Dark Knight.
I love that. Yes, but that's different. But yeah, with Batman, Professor X, and Iron Man, like all of those involve technology and wealth, like hand in hand. And so you take that, and then you look at today, and you're just like, oh God, you could just see where this is going and how problematic that is, and I don't like how those ideas are converging and building off of each other and bouncing off of each other and building this momentum. It's disturbing, and so, like, this idea that I've always had a problem with that. And so when I see things happening now, I'm just starting to think, okay, this has been in the superhero movies all this time. They've been prepping us for this for a long time. Then I start wondering, who's they? And like, who's behind all this? Like, if we're talking about moral ideas in superheroes, whose morals are we talking about? Where's that coming through? And then the idea that these characters are beloved. They're beloved by many. So they're like a vehicle for to push ideas through. It's just causing a whole hurricane in my mind.
Hussein, let's wade through that hurricane. Whose morals? So far, we've taken a Western lens to this. We're
Yeah.
talking about movies that come out of the United States. We're sitting here in the United States having this conversation. Whose morals are we talking about? Are superheroes a uniquely Western concept, or are they around the world?
I think this question of wealth is actually a really interesting way to address that question. So before I say anything, because I don't want it to sound, every billionaire is a policy failure. I just want to be abundantly clear about
Get
that.
it
I just,
said.
right? But when we come to the fictional world and we talk about really make-believe money, right? I mean, there's no way anybody has this much money to fund the stuff that is being funded. But it is interesting to me how money is put out there. Everybody talks about Bruce Wayne, who's Batman, right? Is this billionaire, sees his parents killed. And, instead of, he does actually invest in one homeless shelter. He does, because his parents did that. But, instead of addressing questions of homelessness and sort of addressing questions of mental health, he plays dress up and beats up people, to your point about heroes and violence,
Yeah.
right? And there's, I think, a really sound critique to be made there. I think Tony Stark is a similar vein, and I think he's very morally gray. To your point on technology, right? I think it's the second Iron Man movie, which is Age of Ultron, where he creates this artificial intelligence which wants to take over the world, and everybody's telling him, "Don't do it, don't do it," and he's like, "But I'm rich, I can do it," and he goes and does it.
Bad consequences.
And then Professor Xavier, who heads the X-Men, takes his money to fund kids who don't have money, right? Wealth as enabling the heroism, right? So I think it is interesting how we see this fictional money being distributed and being deployed in these spaces, because it is a question of, is it hyper individualism, or is it for communal good? And then the question is, for me, is still, if it's for the communal good, why do you have this much money to begin with?
Sure.
But I don't think these morals are consistent. I don't think they're universal. I really want to recognize I'm sitting at a table with Nnedi Okorafor, who's written the Binti series, amongst numerous other things, African futurism versus Afrofuturism, right? Like, these are not universal morals. These are very Western. I will say that as a scholar of religion, I have seen how this hyper individualism is tied to hyper masculinity
Yes.
and hyper wealth, and how they'll
Yes.
I've seen
Yes.
images of this like beefed up, bigger than Arnold Schwarzenegger at his prime, Jesus on a cross breaking the cross, and I'm like, do you understand the theology of Jesus breaking the cross? Like,
Wow.
there's a moment there that makes me deeply uncomfortable where this plays out, because it really is not about a moral center. It is about power then defining the moral center, rather than the moral center defining where power sits. And I think for me, things like that make me real uncomfortable. And I can see that slide. We have, I think, to go from Batman, and I think the Christopher Nolan movies as art, as technical, are fantastic, but it is a very dark vision of the world that enables the Joker movies, right? And again, I'll only speak to the first Joker movie. I haven't seen the second one. I can absolutely understand the technical, artistic achievement behind there, but it's such a nihilistic message, right? And here I think it's very much reflecting the society in which we're living in, is that we live in a society that enables the Joker to come out, and nobody's stopping to say, this is actually really wrong,
Yeah.
right? Like, I have no objection to exploring that dark side of humanity, but we've got to recognize it's wrong and not valorize it. And I think that's where we failed in some of these arts, is actually bringing that critical moral lens into some of these conversations.
If we're valorizing that, that begs the question, in something else you touched on there, because you raised a lot of really great points, Hussein. Whether or not these superheroes have supplanted religious figures, superheroes and the supervillains, because you mentioned the Joker, are they our new moral authorities where religious figures might have been once?
I think it's always a yes, no, maybe with this, simply because when we look at particularly the earlier superheroes, there's so much background that is embedded into these. We've talked a little bit about Captain America, but think about the Superman mythos, right? He's an alien from another planet. He is a child set in a space raft to save a people. That is the Moses story. And this is, people have interpreted this, but one of the writers, Grant Morrison, I think it was, who took it over, was very explicit, like, no, this is Moses, and rewrote him explicitly through the lens of
Wow.
Moses. And then with his death and coming back to life, people are like, no, he's Jesus. He's not Moses, right? And so there is this element of mapping on these superheroes onto these religious stories, these pre-existing religious stories. They're part of who we are. They're part of the air we breathe. So of course they're going to get recycled, going to get repurposed, they're going to get remixed. I don't see a problem with that. Um, I think that when they are taken as moral guides in and of themselves, because the stories we tell come with cultural baggage, they come with implicit knowledge, not always explicit knowledge. And I think the risk of treating these superheroes as moral guides rather than as moral reflections is that we lose some of that depth, that complexity that these older stories have. And even when we are creating so-called new stories now, they're still pulling on a depth of implicit knowledge. And so I just fear that when we forget that we are community making stories together, and again, this hyper individualism, we end up looking um, at justifications for our worst instincts rather than criticisms of uh, who we are and a call to elevating who we are.
Hmm. Keith, I want to bring you in here because this is a question I want for the whole table on whether or not you see the idea and the role of superheroes supplanting the role of traditional religious figures for many people.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, if not religious figures, it is interesting how, there's a lot of projection of what you might call superhero politics or superhero symbolism onto, um, I would say, like our Silicon Valley elite, and also onto politicians themselves, right? There's this popular T-shirt that is sold at like Trump rallies, that is like an image of him, wearing like a suit and like a collared shirt, and he's unbuttoning it, and it's got like a superhero S on it, right?
Boy.
And I was talking before about like the justifications that Trump supporters and people on the right often use to say that lately, I mean, with this Abrego Garcia case of the man who was sent wrongly to this El Salvadoran prison, they'll say, oh well, Trump said it and it's right, and it's like an activist judge was the only reason that they let this guy stay here, right? So it's like everything Trump does is sort of like super hero coded in a sense, right? Like he's the one who has a sort of unique understanding of the world and how things work, and so he'll sort of be defended in this way. And it's true with his tariffs too, right? Like there's people who lives would be hurt by all his weird tariff policies that are happening right now, but like they'll defend him because he's sort of is super in a way, I suppose, right? So I think that we do see this mirrored between how people think about their leaders, whether it's political or technocratic. I mean, now Elon Musk is not so much a hot revered figure, but maybe we forget that like 10 years ago, even a lot of liberals were really defensive of him because they saw him as like intrinsic to some techno-utopian project, and he was doing all this environmental good by having this electric car company, and he was very much equated with like, superhero-dom. And even that's a very fascinating kind of mirror between superheroes and politics and political economy, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Nnedi.
Yeah. I also think that Musk created a lot of that himself. But my first instinct is to push back against this idea of superheroes being religious figures. But I'm trying to humor it a little bit. And some of the points you've both brought up, where we're seeing this superhero qualities reflected in if we're talking about Musk or Trump, we're seeing those. Okay, I kind of get the point. I kind of see how superheroes are kind of being used in that way. I'm looking at just how people react to superhero, like the actual superheroes, not the superhero qualities, but the actual superheroes. And there's a great love for them. People are going to see the movies. People are buying the comics. People talk about them a lot. The fandom is very much alive and passionate. But are they looking at these figures? Are they looking to these figures for moral guidance? I don't know. I would venture to say I don't think so. A lot of it to me seems very surface and cosmetic, where, oh, we like to dress up as Spider-Man or
Mhm.
dress up as these characters or pretend we are these characters or, just kind of surface things like that. But if we're talking about like religious and spiritual, I'm conducting my life through the way this superhero behaves. I don't feel like I don't see that. I don't see that. And I think and I also started thinking about Star Wars and Star Trek.
Mm.
Both of those have spawned religions.
Yeah.
There are people who go, religions. So there's that. I don't see that happening with superheroes.
I want to pause you there because I love that you brought that up. And I know the Trekkies and
Yeah.
the Star Wars fans who are watching this are going to love it too. Do you consider those superhero movies? Superhero stories?
I mean, here we are with the definitions again. I just feel like definitions confine, but I mean, so I'm going to just go with the philosophy of, the concept of the definition of the superhero being very broad.
Mhm.
So if I view it that way, yeah, I guess we could we could kind of incorporate characters in Star Wars and in Star Trek as superheroes.
Mm.
Yes. Yeah.
Especially
Yeah.
because with Star Wars, you see some of the underpinnings of what you all have talked about. We see the fight of good versus evil.
Yeah.
There is mention in the movie of the Jedi Knights being a religion, an ancient religion. So
Yeah. And
there
they're also
are themes.
extrajudicial, right? They're judge, jury, and executioner.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
all
But they're
of those
authorized by
things.
the state. They're not. I mean,
Right. That's still unusual. Our state doesn't have many judge, juries, and executioners
Right.
all in one. Yeah.
Okay, so I hear a little bit of a contention there, and I heard earlier what you said, Nnedi, that you don't necessarily see religious and spiritual guidance coming from these superheroes for people, but I wonder if there is moral guidance or if there is moral permission, because
Mhm.
earlier the idea was raised that there is extrajudicial action taken in some of these movies and some of these stories that then translates to the street. Good guys can kill bad guys, and bad guy friends, to put it colloquially. And that's okay. And we root for that as audiences. Is that what you see?
Oh, this is a tough one, Malika. So I think to build on this question, I want to say that I agree with Nnedi that I don't think we're seeing religions forming around superheroes, but I do think that there is moral inspiration. So I do know, having gone to New York Comic Con for many years, that there is a booth there for a group, and I'm blanking on the name right now. One of you may know what I'm talking about, but where they say, are you inspired by a superhero? Why don't you start a club at your school and then figure out what that person would do or the team of superheroes would do to make your community better? So it's a community social club. So, if you think about the older fraternal organizations like Kiwanis Club or the Rotary Club for adults, this is happening at the high school and middle school level and encouraging people to socialize around these superheroes, but then thinking about, well, what would happen if you could do something good for your community? What would it be? And I think it also speaks to, we're talking a lot about, to Keith's point about Spider-Man, he starts out as a street level hero, right? He's in the neighborhood
Right.
versus sort of national, international, intergalactic heroes like Captain Marvel. I think one of my favorites is Luke Cage, who is a man. He had a Netflix series. It was revived in comics or brought more attention to in comics because of that. But again, similar to Isaiah Thomas, the first black captain, or the first Captain America who happens to be a black man, was experimented on and received superpowers, but he's a street level hero in Harlem, really doing good in the community. And so I think that there's this moral inspiration that comes out of that inspires people. And I think Star Trek superhero definitely lower decks. Because they do the impossible out of the impossible. The others I'm not so sure about. But I think there is this moral code here that is being inspired. But I agree, I'm not convinced it's going to be a religion or it will inspire religion yet.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Did you want to weigh in? I heard you saying something in agreement.
Yeah. Well, with regards to religion, I mean, yeah, I don't, I'm don't really have an opinion on that per se. I mean, I was thinking back to what you were saying earlier about wealth, right? About like, we were talking about the a lot of superheroes, like they're super because they can use their wealth to, make super gadgets or something like that. But there's another step in there, right, that I think is a strange omission that you see in a lot of superhero movies where wealth is the component that makes them super, which is the labor to build their super gadgets
Mm.
is invisible,
Oh yeah.
or they do it themselves, or it happens through magic.
Mm.
Or in some cases there is labor producing gadgetry or whatever, but they're very pleased and happy to do it, right? There's none of the normal contradictions or none of the normal issues that anybody who's ever had a job, will know. Like it's not
Yeah.
like even the best job in the world is not just a selfless thing where you're more than happy to do everything. So like it's interesting that the Christopher Nolan Batman movies, right, are a really interesting example of this because there's so much labor that would need to go into building the the Batmobile.
Yep.
And that huge surveillance, the huge room they use to do warrantless surveillance on Gothamites, and all his gadgetry, right? It's like this is tremendous amounts of work. But the only people you ever see doing any work are sort of selfless Butler, and then Batman himself, right? And his Butler is like his identity. He has no identity outside of work. This too, I will note. This is not a good message for Americans. I think because the United States, unlike a lot of like Western democracies, we don't have a very robust welfare state. So a huge amount of your survival in the United States is like dependent on your job, right? Like you typically don't have health care if you don't have a job, right? You might not have a house or a place to live without a job or food, right? So more than other places in the world where those things are, you have more of a guarantee of it. In the United States, our identity is really tied to our job. And this is so interesting how in superhero movies, this is also the case. Their identity is typically entirely their job. And like the Alfred, Batman's butler, is like such a funny example of this. He has no identity outside of just being completely loyal and subservient to Batman.
Yeah, I will just add one point is in the Batman universe is also Lucius Fox, who heads Wayne Industries, who is actually the person who enables all the R&D to happen.
Right.
So there's one other person in that. I just want to,
Yeah,
because
that's a
played.
good
I think
point.
he was played by Morgan Freeman in the Nolan movies, and
Yeah.
and
You're
you
right.
always
There's
have
a
to
third.
give Freeman his props. So
Yeah, that's true. There's a third. Yeah.
I remember when I was writing Shuri, that was something that I thought about a lot.
Yeah.
Because she creates all these various types of technologies, which was so fun to write because I got to make up stuff. So she does that. But as I'm writing it, I'm like, and when you're writing comics, you already have a very limited amount of space. You know the amount of space that you have, and then you have your story summarized and all of that. And so it has to fit in that limited amount of space. So as I'm writing Shuri, creating these amazing technologies, all I kept thinking about was she needs like 50 people that she should be working with,
Yeah.
and then I want to write about those 50 people and what their experiences are, and then how they're interacting with like that's a whole part of the story that I couldn't get in there. It felt to me, and of course I couldn't write about that, but like for me, it just felt like the realism aspect I was stretching things in a way that I did not like, and that's part of like writing novels. You can do that. You can just go
Sure.
off on a tangent and do all of that, but in comics you can't. And I was very conscious of that labor issue, that who is helping her create this technology. This requires a lot of people, a lot of coding, a lot of testing, all of that, and I'm just glossing over it.
Right. And it's so funny because right now we're at this political moment where Americans are realizing, maybe a lot of them for the first time, that actually there's a huge amount of like manufacturing experts who mostly are people working and living in China. And we're finally having this sort of, oh, wait a second, our corporations intentionally sort of like moved all this abroad, and
Yeah.
and all the process engineers
Yep.
and manufacturing engineers and all this labor is actually done there. And like, through the internet and often through like TikTok and Red Note and such, like there are these videos talking back to America being like, look, like here's where we make your purses and here's where we make your leggings and stuff like that. And we're like, oh wow, okay, actually, yeah, that I never a lot of Americans never really thought about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in thinking of the masses who are not thanked and who are happy to work, there's no wage theft in the superhero
Well, actually there is.
tell.
So the only in superhero, this is another, I've written this article called The Labor Laws of the Superhero Universes, right? Because I think it's so fascinating that different properties, different writers consistent through history, have the same sort of rules. There is a group allowed to use coercive labor or even slave labor, and that's a supervillain.
Right.
then
right.
there's
They
there,
always have their minions.
but then there's an ancillary rule about the supervillains' labor, which is that at least, if they're using like their wage labor, right? So the henchmen, they are so, their morals are so subsumed into their jobs that the superheroes can kill or disable them without, so it's like if, which I think is like, this is also, I think, a little problematic. Like, imagine if you're, you really need a job and, Lex Luthor's company's hiring and you're just like a sort of, you're like, oh, gosh, I'm like, my family needs to eat. Like, I'm going to lose my health care. I have a sick kid or whatever. So you get like a custodial job at like, Luthor Corps or whatever it's called. And then, Superman breaks in one day and you're in the way and you get punched out or die.
Yeah.
Right? Like, and it's like you had no real connection to
Yeah.
this job. It was just a job. This, I think, is like one of the funny things about how labor is depicted, the supervillains' labor, or the henchmen's labor, I should say, the lackeys. Like, they're infinitely dispatchable because they are, their morals must be exactly that they believe everything their employer believes. But, you and I know, anyone who's had a job knows that, you're not just like, a sort of servant to your, you don't believe exactly what your boss or your company believes ever. That's not how jobs work.
Yeah. So Nnedi, they're allowed to be collateral damage.
That's what I was going to say. Collateral damage and like this idea. That's one of the biggest issues that I have with superhero narratives in general. Collateral damage.
Yeah.
And on the supervillain side and on the hero side. The people are always just I want to say NPCs, like, they're just
like the masses.
Yeah, they're unnamed. No, they're faceless. They are the people, and they're down. They're definitely down here because you've got when the superheroes fight. What is that proverb? When two elephants fight, the grass suffers. I mean, that is very true when it comes to superhero narratives. When superheroes fight the villains, the people who are in the way, you see cars flying all over. You see people getting thrown about, and the narrative, the point of view of the narrative, never stops on those people. And for me, that is, as a writer, that always just aggravates me because I want to follow the person who just flew over there, that person who has a family, that person who has wants and needs and dreams. Got thrown over there. I want to see what happens to that person. So superhero narratives don't tend to care about the people in that way. And I've always wondered what is the idea of that? Where are those ideas going?
Yeah.
One of the writers I most appreciate, I'm a huge fan of the X-Men, and for many years it was written by a man named Chris Claremont. And the running joke was that if Chris Claremont was spending comic book panel space writing about a character, you knew they were going to die.
Yeah, right.
But you learned about them before they died.
Wow.
And it was a good world. It was a good reminder that there are people who inhabit this world who are collateral damage.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's always been the case, Hussein, because we know that these stories exist for at least 100 years. And from the early to mid 20th century to the 60s and the 70s to the present, how have these superhero narratives evolved, one might say? How have they changed? And how does that then reflect where we are as a society, as a culture?
So there are a couple of things that come into play, I think, that are really relevant for this conversation. One is when we think about Superman, when he starts, he's not quite street level, but he's not the superhero we know. He's not, he leaps tall buildings in a single bound. He actually doesn't fly. And that is actually true. He gets this power boost. He gets this glow up power-wise. But people were imagining this world where it is very simple. It's very good and bad. 1940s comics are this alignment to this point. If you are a Nazi, you are a Nazi, right? Like, it's very easy. And I think that storytelling device persists. I think that's what contributes to some of this. But the Comics Code, which was a voluntary code that comics book publishers of the United States took on in the late 50s, early 60s, one of the things that they agreed to is that you could not kill anybody. You could kill monsters, you could kill vampires, you could kill werewolves, but you couldn't kill human beings. So, which is why you find a lot of antagonists in this era are robotic. or Android because it was safe to kill them and smash them.
Right.
And so there actually was a no killing clause. And I think, and I'm going to refer back to the X-Men because this is the franchise I'm most familiar with after Miss Marvel, is they still struggle about when is it okay to kill somebody and is it okay to kill somebody. They've definitely become more free with it. I think this visiting of superhero violence is a real phenomenon, but there's still a moral question there. Whereas I think in other heroes, and particularly in the rise of the anti-hero, we're finding it much more acceptable for killing to happen. And I'll turn to the Punisher, Frank Castle. His origin story: he's a Marine. He comes back home. His family witnesses a crime, and they're going to testify, and they're killed to silence them. Castle finds out the cops are in the pockets of the mob who are behind the crime, and so he becomes this vigilante. And as the Punisher, he goes out and commits these extrajudicial killings. But he's an anti-hero. He's never portrayed as a hero. He's never a superhero. He never has extra-human powers. He has military background and training. And I think one of the things that is really shocking about this is the number of police officers who hold him up as a value. You often see the Punisher skull on police vests, on bullets that they
Yeah.
put on
Yeah.
their cars,
Yep.
their license plates, these patches. But Castle starts life being anti-police because he sees them as corrupt. And this is instrumental to the story. It's not like, oh, we wrote it and then we forget about it. You can reclaim him. And, no, he's consistently anti-cop because he says, I'm the anti-hero. It's really wrong for me to be killing people, but I'm in a situation where I have to kill people because the cops are in the pockets of the crooks and they're killing innocent people. Like, this is consistently his thing. He's, and so it's really interesting to see this dynamic of how people are misreading these characters as well throughout their stories.
At the risk of hearing Nnedi sigh when I ask this question, I need a definition of an anti-hero. 'Cause I want to make sure we're on the same page.
Yeah, did Taylor Swift get this definition right?
Yeah, exactly.
What is an anti-hero?
Can we call her up and get a
Yeah.
definition? So, I think to the conversation that Nnedi started us off with, if the superhero has a pro-social mission, the hero, we can say, has a pro-social mission, right? This is your firefighter, your teacher, our essential workers who we underpay to our point of labor and wage theft, right? These are our heroes. There's a pro-social mission here. And who are operating within the bounds of the law, within the bounds of the system. I think the anti-hero is somebody who is operating outside any system, and who is doing good, but from their worldview, not necessarily for a greater good, right? So Frank Castle wants to punish criminals. And this is our judge, jury, executioner, right? Like,
Right.
he's literally outside of the judicial system, the state system. He is like, this is a criminal, I will kill them. And so I think it's really about trying to do good from that person's perspective of what the good is, which is different than this whole, everybody's a hero of their own story. I don't think the Joker sees himself as a hero of his own story. I don't think Harley Quinn sees herself as a hero of her own story. I think they do what they do because it makes them feel good, but they're not necessarily doing good.
So are they anti-heroes or are they villains?
They're villains for me.
Okay. So then let's talk about the villains, because every good superhero needs a supervillain. And increasingly, they seem to become more and more popular. So I'm thinking of the Joker, Batman's nemesis, who has a couple movies out. The Wicked Witch from The Wizard of Oz, who is in the retelling in the movie Wicked. What does it say about us that these stories are more and more compelling?
Yeah, you brought up Wicked. I'm more familiar with the novel than the movie. But I think what makes villains, at least to me, it's going to be to me because I have a very specific point of view. But because I've enjoyed this idea of exploring villains. But for me, it's about I want to say humanizing them, but I like character development. One thing I cannot stand about villains in your traditional superhero movies is that they're just bad because they're bad.
Yeah.
This idea that they're just evil, like this idea
Innately
that
bad.
evil is just this thing, and they have no purpose. They have no clear. They just want to do bad, and that's for me. It's always about the realism for me. If I can't believe the story, I don't enjoy the story. So when you have villains like that, I'm not enjoying it. I'm just like rolling my eyes. So this whole thing of exploring villains is intriguing to me because it just kind of it fleshes out their character. It makes them more believable. You can see and I like exploring the other side, like different points of views. I like seeing why would someone do that. So the first joke, I didn't finish the second Joker movie. I just never finished it. But the first one, I found I like enjoyed going into his psyche and seeing where it all came from, how it all manifested, like how it all the circumstances that brought all of that forth. With Wicked, I love that. That was a novel that I loved when it was first published. I loved that novel and identified very strongly with the Wicked Witch of the West. I identified with her so strongly. But like what made her so compelling was just seeing who exactly she was. And then the fact that she eventually becomes this villain, that is a much more intriguing type of narrative, like understanding and seeing it, and maybe empathizing. I guess I don't necessarily have to. I don't empathize with the Joker at all, but I'm just completely fascinated by that, and this idea that a villain is a lot of things. It's not just evil just for evil's reason, like for evil's existing. I think that's and I also think that exploring the idea of the villain and fleshing out those characters, I feel is just a really good exercise. It's a really good conversation that society needs to have.
I wonder what you think. What is it like to sit in a movie theater and perhaps see people cheering on the supervillain?
Interesting. I mean, I think, okay, this is a slightly hot take, but I think the reason supervillains, anti-heroes, and superheroes are popular may all come from the same thing, at least in part, which is that we have an increasingly right-wing view of criminality, right? And what I mean by this is, like, if you think people are born evil, right? And this is often something that, the supervillain is born evil or whatever. If you believe that crime is something that doesn't happen because of social reasons, right? Of need or desperation or, no political horizon for somebody. But if you think that crime has happened because certain people are just born evil, then superheroes and anti-heroes, they're very appealing to you, right? Because you're like, okay, there's nothing wrong with this sort of, extrajudicial, like, super cop type figure because, there's just people out there who are like that, right? But this idea that crime, is not socially determined. I mean, this is easily just disproven by looking at crime statistics around the world, right? Like, if there were people who were just born evil and crime was because of that, then every country would have the exact same murder rate, the exact same burglary rate. It would all just be, this tiny percentage that genetically, has this disposition. But you don't see that in the world. I mean, these things vary depending on the social and political nature and culture of a country. But I think that's all interlinked.
I think for me, the Joker movies are really interesting because it is sympathy for the villain, which could invite understanding, but I think also opens the door to say it is okay for me to have this nihilism. I think the difference between that and, let's say, Wicked and Alphaba is it is changing the perspective through which the story is told, right? And I think that's Maguire's, the author, his great talent is having a shift that perspective, right? This story was told, you're hearing this story generations after it actually happened, but this is what actually happened and why it had to be told this way. It's partially protective, but then we build up these stronger strictures and powers around it. I think one of the great retellings of a villain origin story in the comics is of a character named Magneto, who's Professor X's alternating between best friend and arch nemesis. But he's written as a Holocaust survivor, which is what explains what motivates him to be really strident in his defense of mutants. And Greg Pak wrote a series called Testament about what it was like for Magneto growing up during the Nazi period. And you see his family arguing, is violent resistance better? Is agreement, is going along with the flow better? And seeing how these different things play out for different parts of the family, and having Magneto's character, Eric, his alter ego, or his true ego, his true self, watching all of this and realizing that the only thing that stopped the Nazis was violence, like informing his worldview, you're like, oh, that gives me such a deep sense of understanding of who he is, that I can sympathize with him as a person and still question, is violence the right answer? Right? Which I think is much more complex than what the Joker movie gave us.
And of course, we can't even bring up those two characters in X-Men without talking about some of the inspiration, Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King
Martin Luther
Jr.,
King Jr.,
right?
yeah.
Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so the two characters, the two, protagonist, antagonist are Charles Xavier, Professor X, whom we've already discussed, and Magneto. Professor X sees a world of harmony between humans and mutants, and Magneto's, is a mutant nationalist, for lack of a better term. Mutants cannot live with humans, humans cannot live with mutants. It's often compared that way. The timing actually doesn't quite work out for that comparison. And I think it's really simplistic, because Magneto is a bit more of a burn it all down. And Malcolm, even when he was part of the Nation of Islam, was never in a burn it all down stage.
Right.
He was always, this is what our people need. This is what the nation needs. How do we build this nation? And Martin Luther King Jr. has been valorized. I mean, when you think about how he was treated during his lifetime, right? Where the FBI is saying, why don't you go commit suicide? You're like, he also understood the value of violence, but his violence was committing a moral violence against the nation, right? Non-violence was demanding the nation look at itself, the white nation look at itself as a violent nation. And we don't often see it that way, because it wasn't smashing windows, right? But it was still violence against the nation for it to confront its own violence. That's why when we look at the dogs being unleashed by Bull Connor, when we look at the hosing down of black nonviolent protesters, it is that very expression of violence that that Martin is able to call forward by his moral push against what the nation is. So I understand the parallel. I'm really uncomfortable with it for various reasons. And I'm also really uncomfortable with two very rich white men or white passing men being mapped out to black men who are leading very different types of movements.
So what problems are superheroes solving? Fighting bad guys, but not, say, fighting systemic racism, systemic poverty, other societal ills and issues. What are they fighting? What are they doing, Nnedi?
Oh, me again. I mean, as you were saying that, it just keeps coming back to this idea of what is a superhero. I just keep coming back to that, because I mean, as we've been talking, I've been thinking about other characters, and outside of DC and Marvel, and who would they? What type of superheroes are they? And one that we haven't really talked about is Hayao Miyazaki's characters, because when we think about the villain and versus the superhero, those things get muddled, and his stories do that intentionally. So, and if I'm thinking about his characters, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, for example, it's not just about like getting rid of the villain. It's also she's a very moral character. Like her arrival changes the people and gives the people hope. So I think that might be something that superheroes can bring to societies that are outside of the usual things. This idea of hope and understanding as well. So it really comes back to this definition of superhero, because there are characters in novels that I've read also where I would consider them superheroes, but they don't have any special or they don't have any traditionally superpower powers. Yeah, are super powerful powers. Yeah, you know what I mean. Like, you know what I
Yeah.
mean.
Yeah.
They don't have those, but I would consider them. I would consider them superheroes in a more broader sense.
Yeah.
So, and they're bringing all kinds of the characters that I'm thinking of bring all kinds of change and and different ideas. So it really depends on how broad your definition of superhero is.
Nnedi, I think you're the winner for giving us the first note of optimism of this conversation. I heard hope, I
Thank
heard
you.
optimism there. So I'm going to pivot to you, Keith.
Ugh.
What do superheroes give us? What are they doing?
Yeah. I think that I mean, and this is true of the film. Again, I'm going to say this is true of superhero films because the comics are much more multifarious. But I think superhero films solve a problem for the elite, for the ruling class, right? Which is how do we how do we popularize a kind of ideology that, lets us maintain our control and our hegemony, right? And it's because superhero movies, they sort of posit or present this world where and Nnedi was saying this before, actually, that the masses are sort of powerless, right? That how does political change, how does social change happen in the superhero film universes? It happens from above. It doesn't happen from below, right? And this is contrary to how politics works everywhere else in the real world, which is that all sort of mass movements, civil rights movements, they start from below. They don't usually start from the elites being like, oh, we're going to give the people something that will reduce our political power a little bit. Like, that's not how it works. But in the super universes, this is always how it works, right? It's like big social change happens because of the fights between the villains and the superheroes, or they sort of unilaterally decide how to change or affect the world. Everybody else is just sort of like set dressing. And again, you're either set dressing, you're one of the masses, you're just kind of sitting around waiting to be saved by them if a car or whatever flies at you, or you're a sort of hapless, custodial employee at LexCorp or whatever who just gets beaten up and killed for being involved in Lex Luthor's project, right? So I think that that's one way that I think the films are solving a problem, you would say, at least for elites.
When it comes to the problems that they're solving, Hussein, do you see an evolution in these stories from a more optimistic past to perhaps a more dystopian future, postmodern grayness, if you will?
I think when we talk about superheroes, I would focus, rather than the movies, I'd focus a little bit more, excuse me, I'd focus a little bit more on the comics, where you do have this, I don't want to say bifurcation, but an acknowledgement that there are heroes that are fighting these world-ending events, robot invasions, planet-eating monster, whatever it is, and the street-level heroes. And the heroes that are facing, the robot invasion are not actually looking at systems. The street-level heroes are the ones who are looking at systems. So I mentioned Luke Cage before, really embedded in the Harlem community. I think both in the comics and in the TV show, he addresses systematic racism head on, looks at what it means to the community, how communities have responded to it, and ways they can respond to it. Giving agency, not necessarily waiting for the superhero to come in, not waiting for for Luke Cage to come in. Or the Iron Man or whoever to come in, but recognizing that they could be part of the community-based solution. I think Miss Marvel, her TV show, she has this, she's a Muslim, and it's a critique both of the surveillance state that's being pushed against Muslims, but in the comic book, she actually talks about affordable housing, and that actually becomes a huge part of her life in Jersey City. And so I think you do see these characters dealing with systematic issues. Now, whether they come to resolution or not, I don't know, but the fact that they acknowledge them, they say this is how people are really dealing with them. I think you do get some on the ground level, I think is really important. Is this the postmodern era of the gray superhero? I think that does a disservice to postmodernism, which is really about trying to move beyond binaries. To Keith's earlier point about this, the good guys will always win and the bad guys are definitionally bad. I think postmodernism is trying to get beyond binaries. It's trying to understand the alphabet of it all. And I think that's really important to recognize, is that when you understand complexity, when you understand the systematic work that needs to be done, then that opens up the space for solutions. But whereas if you're like, this is good, this is bad, then you're always looking for the good thing to cancel the bad thing. And the good thing is not always good for everybody. It's whose values, whose power, who's succeeding in this, as opposed to thinking about it socially. Like, if I do X, it's good for me, but how does it harm somebody else? That's really what I think we're trying to be called into through this. And so it is that systematic question that I think is so fascinating, that allows that space of constructive movement.
Asking that question, if I do this, who else is being harmed? Is it harming somebody else? Raises the idea of representation, who that somebody else is. And you mentioned giving agency. And so I wonder, Nnedi, I'll pose this to you. If you think that representation, seeing characters like Miss Marvel, seeing Muslim characters, Black characters, more female characters, economically marginalized heroes, seeing them on the screen, seeing them on the page, does that solve some of the issues that we've raised here today with the genre?
I think it does solve some of it. I think it I wouldn't say solve. I think it addresses some of it. But if you have characters that have not been represented much prior, now represented, and they're still doing the same thing, it's like it's addressing it, but it's not not solving it. So it's so representation isn't the only key. Like, it's not the only piece of the puzzle that we need. It is a piece of the puzzle that we need. And I also want to say that representation is not the same thing as replacing. And I'm always talking about this because I personally don't like the replacing thing.
Tell us what you mean.
This may be a controversial thing. So,
This is a debate. There will be many controversial things.
Okay, well, those who hear these words, it's okay if you disagree. It's fine. We can have a conversation about it. Don't, but like, I don't like the idea of rewriting characters and
To be a different
a
race
different
or culture or
whatever,
background.
different race, different gender, different I'm not a fan of that. I am a fan of adding, not replacing. So, and I think that that's only part of it. It's not just a cosmetic shift. So when it comes to that's what Miss Marvel was great with. It was like it's adding the issue of representation, but it's like a full body addressing it. So it's not just like visually replacing that character with someone of a less represented group, but also we're talking culture. We're talking, okay, how does this culture affect the story? How does this thing happen now if we're dealing with this type of family who has this type of cultural background? What are the shifts? That's interesting. And I think in that regard, to contradict myself completely, in that regard, representation can solve an issue if it's real representation, if it's not just cosmetic, if it's real. So yeah, if we're dealing with if we're addressing the cosmetic part, but it goes all the way down, where we see the family, we see where they live, we see the philosophies that come with the culture and how that shifts the point of view. Point of view is really big. And I can say this as a storyteller. Point of view is part of the story. It changes the story. It shifts the story. It's a different type of story if it's a different type of point of view. So I think that so in these ways we can start kind of addressing things and telling more stories. And the more points of views we have, the more stories we have, the greater variety of superheroes, for example, that we'll have. I think that like the idea of having different types of superheroes I keep talking about broadening this idea of what a superhero is. I think that will add to that effect.
Yeah. Well, in shifting the story and shifting the lens of the story, do you think that helps your criticisms, or is it simply not doing enough to address the overarching narrative that some might find toxic?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I really, when I read about this, I really emphasized that, like, the cultural politics of like superhero films and narratives are sort of separate from the political narratives. Like, I think this is generally true, and that a lot of modern superhero movies have, like, they have great representation, and this can be like an overall positive social thing, right? Even if maybe the political morals are troubling to some extent. But it's interesting also. I mean, like, I think there is sometimes a structural critique that's embedded in some aspects of the representation, as Nnedi was saying. Like, I was really fascinated by the way that, like, the Black Panther movie imagined, like, what would an African country that was spared from colonialism like look like, and the sort of the imagination involved in that, like, that is very, I think, like, politically powerful and like a very interesting message, and something that, frankly, like, more people should sort of think about and consider. Like, it's sort of a utopian, thing to imagine.
Keith, Hussein, Nnedi, if you will allow me a pun, this conversation has flown by faster than a speeding bullet. But we are almost at the end because our time is up. So I want to end with an adage. It has its roots in religion, in Islam, and other cultures as well. There's a saying that many of us probably know: show me who your friends are, and I'll tell you who you are.
Mm-hmm.
I want to tweak it a little bit for the purposes of this debate that we just had. Tell me what your superpower is, and it just might tell us who you are. So let's end with that. And I'll give that one to you first.
What my superpower is?
Yeah.
I guess, I don't know, the power of being a critic or something, or like social, I don't know. Yeah, something like that.
Well, what do you wish your superpower was?
Oh, what I wish it was an actual real. That's a good question. Right. I see this often framed as like sometimes you get this in like game, you're playing a social game with friends and it's like flight or invisibility, right? That seems to be one of the common ones, or the most commonly thought of ones. I actually think I would choose time travel. I want to see what the future's like, and I want to see what the past is like, right? And I think that I sometimes think, as like a sort of cultural critic or social critic, I wonder how knowable is the past? How knowable is the future? How much can we predict? Like, probably a lot of what I think we think from reading about the past is wrong because we're not there.
The better to critique the present. Thank you for that. Hussein, your superpower.
Oh, I get asked this a lot. And I think the point I've come to in my life is I don't want one, because I can't imagine me not being tempted to use it for the worst possible outcome.
The supervillain in you would come
The
out.
supervillain in me would come out. And I think, I think I am quite happy just being plain old me, trying to figure out who I am before I get the juice.
Nnedi.
Fair enough. Flight. It's going to be the most cliche one out there. It's what I do when I am lucid dreaming. The few times I'm able to lucid dream, the first thing I will do is and fly. It's flight is just there's a freedom to it. It's probably something that I have dreamt of and wanted since I was a kid. So I'm just going to go with the one that's very obvious.
I like it. Well, because I asked you, I think I should give my own. I want it to be an invisibility cloak. I think it would help with my journalism.
Totally.
So I'll pick that one. Nnedi Okorafor, Hussein Rashid, Keith Spencer, thank you so much for this debate. Thank you for this spirited conversation. I think we found disagreement, we found common ground, and I learned things. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having us.
If you enjoyed this conversation and want to see more, subscribe to the Doha Debates YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any future episodes.